The Sand had been watching the Hollow for 4 to 7 years, and in all that time it had never once watched her back. She existed at the edge of the observation platform, her crystalline body catching the faint starlight that passed through the reinforced panels of the station. In the absence of strong illumination, she was nearly invisible. Her facets absorbed light at most angles rather than reflecting it, a trait of the Mirehn that had made them nearly impossible to detect in the early centuries before they had developed artificial light sources of their own. Now, under the soft amber glow of the station's interior lamps, she was a presence rather than a shape, a slow-shifting geometry of angles and planes, roughly bipedal in the loosest sense, though she had 4 primary limbs instead of 2, and her torso was a lattice structure rather than a solid mass. Her face, if one could call it that, was a forward-facing cluster of sensory facets that perceived vibration, electromagnetic frequency, and chemical composition simultaneously. She had no eyes in the biological sense. She did not need them. What she had instead were resonance chambers, hollow spaces within a crystalline structure that processed information the way an instrument processes sound, transforming raw input into coherent meaning through the mathematics of waveform interaction. When she thought, her body hummed at frequencies below hearing. When she spoke, she sang. And when she calculated, which was a truest form of experience, the thing that made her most herself, every facet of her body vibrated in synchronized harmonics that her colleagues could read from across a room, the way another species might read a face. Right now, her body was nearly silent. That was how still she was. The Hollow occupied the primary viewport of Observation Station Vethkana, and it occupied it the way a wound occupies a body, not as a presence but as an absence so definitive that everything around it seemed to lean away. It did not glow. It did not pulse. It did not do anything at all. It simply was not, in a region of space where the coordinates said it should be. The Sand had spent her entire scientific career developing more sophisticated ways to describe what she was looking at, and the most sophisticated description she had yet achieved was this: nothing. Not empty. Not void. Not vacuum. Nothing. The word in Mirehn was kethveral, a mathematical term before it was a linguistic one, describing the state of a variable that has not been assigned any value, not zero, not null, but genuinely, structurally, definitionally absent from the equation. The Hollow was a kethveral in the fabric of reality. She had written that sentence in 9 separate research papers over 4 to 7 years, and in each paper she had followed it with a different attempt at explanation, and in each paper the explanation had eventually collapsed under the weight of what it could not account for. She had built theoretical models that predicted the Hollow could not exist, then refined them to account for the fact that it did, then rebuilt them again when the refinements created new impossibilities. She had sent 43 probes into the boundary of the Hollow over the course of her career. None had returned. Not destroyed. She would have understood destruction, could have modeled it, would have welcomed the data. They simply ceased to transmit at the boundary, ceased to exist on any sensor, and never came back. The 4th probe was currently preparing for launch. The Sand had spent 11 years designing it differently from all the previous ones. Instead of seeking to penetrate the Hollow and transmit data outward, the 4th probe was designed to exist at the boundary, to sit precisely at the edge of the kethveral and measure the transition itself. The mathematics of boundary conditions. The rate of reality's recession. Because the Hollow was growing. She had known this for 3 years. She had told no one for 2 of those years, because she had not believed her own instruments. She had spent 2 years recalibrating, remeasuring, running the harmonics of her data through every verification process she knew, and the answer had remained the same. The Hollow was expanding, slowly, measurably, consistently. At its current rate, the nearest inhabited system, Herat-Dal, a Mirehn colony world of 3 billion, would be consumed in approximately 300 years. She had published the findings 14 months ago. The response from the Mirehn Resonance Council had been what she expected. Escalating alarm expressed in increasingly high-frequency harmonics during committee meetings, followed by the formation of a multi-species task force, followed by almost nothing. There were other species out there now. The news was spreading. The Sand was aware that she had started something she could not fully control. What she was not prepared for was a sensation, which had arrived 3 days ago and not left since, that the Hollow was somehow aware of her in return. She knew this was not possible. She knew it was irrational. She was a Mirehn scientist, and irrationality was a dissonance, an unresolved harmonic, something the mind could not tolerate for long before seeking resolution. And yet the sensation persisted. the feeling of being observed by something that should not be capable of observing anything. She turned from the viewport and walked toward the probe bay. The 4-4 probe was waiting. It was time. Commander Draft did not think of himself as a creature of fear. He thought of himself as a creature of assessment. He stood on the bridge of the Vorak Permanence, the flagship of the 7th Deep Fleet, and assessed. The bridge was built to his species scale, which meant it was enormous by almost any standard. Ceilings 4 border heights above the floor, consoles and control surfaces that responded to manipulation by limbs the size of small trees, walkways wide enough for 2 Vorak to pass without turning sideways. The Vorak Permanence was not a vessel of subtlety. It was 3 kilometers long, armored in reactive plates of grown biological material so dense that conventional energy weapons tended to heat and scatter before they could penetrate, and it carried within its hull a crew of 9,000 and a weapons complement that could, in theory, crack the crust of a rocky world. Drath himself was, by the standards of his species, unremarkable in size. He stood a little over 3 body lengths tall, about 4 meters, by some measurements, and was built the way his species was built, dense, lateral, heavily plated. His exoskeletal armor was not the product of artifice. He had grown it, as all Vorak grew it, over the course of 60 years of biological development, shaped by diet and training and the physical demands of military service. The plates overlapped across his back and shoulders and upper limbs in patterns that were partly functional, partly the physical record of his history, the places where he had been struck hard enough to cause reactive growth, the asymmetries that spoke of old damage and successful repair. His face was a forward mass of sensory apparatus, 2 large compound perception organs that functioned in multiple light ranges, a jaw structure capable of crushing things significantly harder than most other species' bones, and a complex arrangement of vocal anatomy that produced a deep, layered sound of Vorak speech, a language that operated on 3 simultaneous frequency bands, with different informational content encoded in each layer. He had been at war, in one form or another, for 40 years. This was not unusual for his species or his rank. The Vorak had been at war continuously for 6,000 years, cycling through periods of external conflict and internal consolidation with the regularity of a biological process, as though warfare were a metabolic function rather than a political choice. They had not always won. They had, on 4 separate occasions across their history, nearly lost everything. But they were still here, their fleet still growing, their territory still expanding, and this, Drath had been taught since he was small enough to fit in his mother's secondary grip, was what mattered. He had not been sent to the Hollow because the Vorak High Command feared it. He had been sent because they needed to know whether it could be fought. He had come to understand over 3 weeks of transit, a question that did not have an obvious answer. The Hollow was not an enemy. It had no fleet, no fortifications, no intent. It was a phenomenon. You could not fight a phenomenon. You could, potentially, contain it. You could potentially find its source and eliminate that source. Or you could, potentially, find nothing and return to report that nothing could be done, which was not an outcome Draft was willing to accept because it was not an outcome the Vorak High Command was willing to accept, and the distinction between what Draft was willing to accept and what he was capable of accepting had long since collapsed under weight of career. What he had found, on arrival, was not what he had expected. He had expected nothing. He had been briefed on the scientific literature, not in detail, but in summary, the way a commander absorbs intelligence reports, extracting tactical significance and discarding context. He knew the Hollow was empty. He knew it was growing. He knew probes sent into it did not return. He had expected to arrive, assess the boundary, perhaps attempt a weapons test to see if the boundary itself responded, and begin the process of forming a strategy. What he had not expected was the other ship. Mirehn configuration, said his tactical officer, a younger Vorak named Veth whose plates were still smooth with inexperience. Station class, not vessel class. It appears to have been anchored here for some time. Years, perhaps. We're reading crystalline biology aboard, multiple individuals, but very few. A scientific team. Draft stood and looked at the forward display, which showed the Hollow in all its absolute nothing, and the small angular structure of the Mirehn station positioned at its edge. He had no particular attitude toward the Mirehn. They were not a species the Vorak had fought, which made them, by default, a species of neutral interest. They were scientists, primarily, methodical, harmonic, physically non-threatening, though their mathematical capabilities were well beyond what most species could match. "What are they doing?" he asked. "Preparing to launch something," Veth said. "Small object, high sense of complement. A probe, most likely. Into the hollow. Toward the boundary, not through it." Draft were quiet for a moment, which among his species was a signal worth reading. His plates were still, his triple-band voice silent, his compound perception organs fixed on the display. "Contact them," he said. "Formally. Use standard multispecies protocols. I want to speak with whoever is in charge. And if they decline contact." Draft turned his full gaze toward Veth, which had the same effect on young Vorak that it had always had. "They will not decline," he said. He was right. They did not decline. But by the time contact was established, something had changed at the boundary, and the probe launch was delayed, and the Mirehn scientist who appeared on Drath's communication screen, a being of quiet crystalline geometry whose facets shifted with what he was beginning to learn to read as distress, told him in clipped, translated tones that the boundary of the hollow had moved. Not grown, moved, in a direction that had no name in her language, because it was not a direction in the three spatial dimensions they both inhabited. "Say that again," Drath said. "The hollow moved," said the San of the Mirehn, briefly, and then it stopped, and then it was still. But in that moment, something came out of it. Drath assessed this for exactly the time it took his secondary respiratory system to complete one cycle. "What?" he said. "I do not yet know," said the San. "But my senses say it is not material, not energy as I can measure it. Something else. Something for which I do not yet have a category." She looked at him, or rather her sensory facets oriented in a way that suggested directed attention, and she said something that surprised him. "Commander Drath, I believe we are not alone out here. I believe there is a third party already present, and I believe they have been present much longer than either of us." Sova had no body. This was not a tragedy. It was simply the nature of being Freni. She was a pattern of coherent consciousness, organized, stable, persistent, existing in a medium that was neither space nor time as most species understood either. The Freni did not inhabit locations. They inhabited moments. And a moment, for Sova, had a texture and a depth that most species could barely begin to imagine. She could feel the shape of the present instant in all its layered complexity, the past bleeding into it from behind, the future pressing against it from ahead, both of them vivid and accessible and present the way that both walls of a corridor are present to something traveling through it. She was very old, even by Freni reckoning, which did not measure age in years but in the depth of one's temporal perception. She was old. She had witnessed, directly witnessed, with the full clarity of a consciousness present at the moment, events that other species called ancient history. She had perceived the formation of star systems. She had watched the slow emergence of biological life on worlds long since gone cold. She had been present, in her way, when the first Vorak Armada had launched its first campaign, when the first mirror mathematician had inscribed the first formal proof on a crystalline face, when the galaxy had been young and its civilizations were learning, one by one, that they were not alone. She did not, as a rule, attend to things happening in physical space. The affairs of material species were audible to her the way distant sound is audible, present, interpretable, but not central. She moved through the temporal landscape of the present moment, attending to the harmonics of cause and consequence, the beautiful complexity of a universe unfolding in real time, and she was largely content. Until the voice. It had come to her 7 years ago, and it had not stopped. It was not a voice in any literal sense. It did not have sound, did not have words, not in any language she knew or could translate. It was more like the shadow of a thought, the shape of meaning before meaning is expressed, the structure of an idea forming in the mind at the moment of its first formulation. And it came from the hollow. This should not have been possible. The Freni could perceive the temporal dimension of things, the past and future resonance of objects, events, choices, but only of things that existed. The hollow, by definition, was the absence of existence. It had no past, because nothing within it had a history. It had no future, because nothing within it could project forward in time. It was a blank in the temporal landscape, a silence so absolute that for most of her long life, the hollow had been the one place she simply did not look. Not because she was afraid of it, because there was nothing there to see. And then the thought had begun. It was incomplete. It was fragmented. It was enormous, not in the way size is measured in material space, but in the way a very large mind is enormous, the sheer scale of what was there pressing against the limits of her perception the way a star presses against the edge of a lens. She could only see the periphery of it, the edges of the thought, the trailing resonances of something so vast that even the fragments were almost beyond her capacity to hold. But she had been holding them for 7 years, and she had been moving toward the hollow for 7 years, as close to it as a consciousness without location could be said to be close to anything. And she had been doing what the Freni did when they encountered something they did not understand. She had been listening. What she had heard, distilled to the simplest possible rendering that her consciousness could construct, was this: I am beginning, I am ending, what was lost, what will be found, the interval. It repeated, not exactly. Each repetition was slightly different, like a mind working through a problem from a slightly different angle on each pass, like something struggling toward coherent thought from a starting point of formlessness. And in the last 3 days, it had grown louder. Sova had been among the civilizations of the galaxy long enough to know that this was the kind of thing that required attention from more than one perspective. She was not, despite her age and her temporal perception, omniscient. She could perceive the shape of what was happening around the hollow, but she could not analyze it the way a scientist could not assess it the way a military mind could. She needed, uncomfortably, the perspectives of the material species she had spent so long observing from the outside. She oriented herself toward the hollow, which for Freni meant something like settling the full attention of her consciousness on a single locus of the temporal field, and she waited. The Mirehn scientist would arrive soon. She had already seen this. The Vorak commander had arrived that morning. She had seen this too, had, in fact, seen it before it happened, the way she always did, though seeing was always clearer after the fact than before it. The third thing she had seen she was keeping to herself. For now, it was a thought completing itself. The probe launched at the 3rd hour of the station day, and Dusan watched it go with the careful stillness of someone who has waited 11 years for a moment. It was smaller than a Mirehn fist, dense with sensor architecture, built in the mathematical language of her species. Every component placed according to the harmonic principles that govern Mirehn engineering. Nothing wasted, nothing redundant, every element vibrating in resonance with every other. She had poured herself into it designed the way her species poured themselves into anything that mattered, completely, down to the mathematical bedrock, testing each assumption against the harmonics of fact until what remained was as close to true as she could make it. The probe did not attempt to cross the boundary. It approached to within a measurable fraction of a measurement unit, a distance so small it was barely a concept in material terms, and stopped there. Its sensors turned on, and it began to transmit. Dusan read the data on her primary display and felt her resonance chambers sing in a frequency she had not produced in years, the harmonic of surprise. The boundary was not a wall. She had always assumed, in the deepest mathematical architecture of her models, that the boundary of the hollow was an edge, that reality simply stopped there the way a surface stops at its own edge. But the probe was telling her something different. The boundary was a transition zone, and within that transition zone there were gradients, not of energy. The probe measured no energy flux, not of matter, not of any field she had terminology for, but gradient of something that her probe's most experimental sensor array, the one she had designed herself over the last 4 years, specifically to measure what she didn't know how to measure, was encoding as variations in a value she had labeled X prime null. X prime null was a mathematical term for the quantity of existence at a given point. It was not a recognized term in any scientific literature. She had invented it 3 years ago when she first realized she needed it. It was the answer to the question, how much does this location exist? For every location she had ever measured, everywhere in the galaxy, the answer was one, completely, fully, unambiguously existent. There was no partial existence. You either were or you weren't. Except at the boundary of the hollow, the probe was telling her the value of X prime null was not 1. It was not 0 either. That would have been the hollow side. It was a gradient, a smooth mathematical curve from 1 to 0, distributed across a transition zone that was, by her best measurement, approximately 300 meters wide. Existence thinning, like the edge of a shadow, like the shoreline where water becomes land. She was still processing this when the Vorak commander's voice came through her communication panel. Scientist San said the delayed, multi-frequency rumble that her translation system was struggling with. Vorak's speech was complex to render, carrying emotional and informational harmonics that most translation matrices flattened into something less than the original. I have been reviewing what you transmitted to me. You said something came out of the hollow. I said my senses registered something that did not originate from this side of the boundary, she corrected. This was a Mirehn habit. Precision. Always. I cannot yet say what it is. My senses agree with yours, Draft said, which surprised her. She had not expected the Vorak fleet to have instrumentation sensitive enough to detect what she had detected. She revised her assessment upward. Whatever it is close to your station. It is not moving. My tactical systems cannot get a lock on it because it does not appear to have a consistent physical profile. A pause. What is your theory? The Sand considered. Her facet shifted. Processing. I do not yet have a theory, she said. I have a sensation, and I am going to conduct myself as a scientist, not as a being who acts on sensations. There was a longer pause. When Draft spoke again, there was something in the layering of his voice, even filtered through translation, that she could not quite parse. I believe we are being contacted, he said. Whatever is out there is not hiding. It is not approaching. It is simply present. And my experience tells me that when a thing with unknown capabilities positions itself near you without aggression or concealment, it is usually trying to communicate. This was, she thought, an interesting perspective from a being who had spent his life at war. She filed it. I will extend my sensor array, she said. I will attempt to characterize what is present. What her extended sensor array showed her was nothing she could have prepared for. The something outside her station was not material. It cast no shadow, displaced no space, emitted no radiation, absorbed no light. It was detectable only in the way that a very precise mathematical instrument can detect the shape of something by what it does to the medium around it. Her probe's X-prime readings, at a cluster of coordinates roughly 100 meters from the station hull, showed a pattern, not a gradient. A pattern, coherent, organized, stable, a pattern in the fabric of existence itself. She stared at the data for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done in 4 to 7 years of solo research. She spoke her next thought out loud, to the open communication channel, to the Vorak commander 3 kilometers away in his enormous warship. There's a consciousness here, she said. Not physical, not energy-based. It exists in the X-prime null field itself. She paused, because the next sentence was almost impossible for a Mirehn scientist to say. I cannot measure it. I can only detect its shape. Draft received this information and did the thing he did with all information of uncertain tactical relevance. He put it in a separate part of his mind, labeled it unknown factor, and proceeded to act on the things he did know. He knew the hollow was growing. He knew its current rate of expansion. He knew what lay in its path. He knew the Vorak response to existential threat, and he knew his own response to being unable to identify the nature of a threat, which was frustration expressed as action. He authorized 2 of his secondary survey craft to take up positions around the Mirehn station, at distances that were close enough to be protective, should protection be needed, and far enough to be non-threatening. This was a subtle diplomacy that Draft had developed over decades of contact with smaller species. The Vorak presence was always large, always armored, always capable of enormous violence, and the only thing that kept this from being perpetually antagonizing was the care with which he positioned that presence. Close enough that your allies know you are there. Far enough that your allies can breathe. He had not decided whether the Sand was an ally. He was proceeding as if she might be. What he did next was send a personal communication directly to the Mirehn Resonance Council, which was the governing scientific authority of the Mirehn civilization and the body that had, according to his briefing documents, tasked the Sand with her research. He did this not because he needed their permission for anything, but because he needed their institutional knowledge. 4 to 7 years of data about the hollow, held by a single scientist at a remote station, was useful. 4 to 7 years of institutional records, cross-referenced with a full history of Mirehn exploration in this region of space, would be more useful. While he waited for a response, he reviewed what he knew about the Freni. His briefing on the Freni was thin, which was itself informative. The Vorak intelligence apparatus was extremely thorough, and when it produced a thin brief, it usually meant the subject was either too new or too alien to have been properly penetrated. The Freni brief was thin because the Freni were too alien. They had no territory in any meaningful sense. They had no fleet, no weapons, no political structure that a conventional intelligence apparatus could map. They existed, insofar as they could be said to exist anywhere, in a state that was perpendicular to the normal categories of existence, and the closest a brief came to a concrete description was beings of pure consciousness, temporally distributed, currently present in this region of space, exact number unknown, possibly as few as one. Draft had encountered, in 6,000 years of Vorak military history, exactly 3 alien civilizations that the Vorak had chosen not to engage militarily. The Freni were one of them. This was not a decision that had been made easily. It had been made, after long deliberation, on the basis of a single tactical reality. The Freni could not be killed. You could not kill something that had no physical form. You could not threaten something that experienced time as a landscape it could navigate freely. You could not intimidate something that had already, in some meaningful sense, seen how things would turn out. The Vorak relationship with the Freni was, therefore, the most unusual relationship in their history, mutual non-interference, maintained not through treaty but through a shared understanding that neither side had anything useful to offer the other as an adversary, which meant, Draft thought, that if a Freni was present at the Hollow, and the Mirehn scientists seemed to think one was, then the Freni had chosen to be here. And the Freni did not, by all available accounts, do things without reason. He was considering this when the presence simply appeared on his bridge. Not physically. There was nothing to see, no manifestation, no visible event. But every one of the 9,000 crew members on the Vorak Permanence became aware simultaneously of something that could not be described as a sound or sight but could perhaps, at a stretch, be described as a weight, a quality of attention that was very large, very old, and very deliberately directed. It was a sensation of being looked at by something that could see you not just as you were now, but as you had been and as you would be, all at once, from a vantage outside the flow of time. Draft had been told about this. He had thought the descriptions were metaphor. They were not metaphor. He stood very still on his bridge. His crew stood very still. Nobody spoke. Then, through a medium that was not quite sound and not quite thought, something communicated. It did not use language. It used meaning directly, unpackaged, context-free, arriving fully formed inside the mind of whoever received it the way a mathematical truth arrives, not through an argument but through sudden apprehension of the relationship between things. What arrived in Draft's mind was this. The thought is nearly complete. When it completes, the interval closes. What you call expansion is not growth. It is breath. And then the weight lifted. And the bridge was just a bridge, and every member of his crew turned to look at him simultaneously, waiting. Draft was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then he opened the channel to the Mirehn station. "The San," he said. "The Freni just spoke to me." Sova withdrew slightly from the Vorak vessel and attended to both material beings at once, which for her was easy. The simultaneity of her consciousness was one of its fundamental properties. She could perceive 1,000 events at once if she chose to. She usually chose not to, out of a kind of aesthetic discipline. There was more to be gained from depth of attention than breadth of it. But right now, the 2 material beings in front of her required parallel attention, because they were processing in fundamentally different ways and both processes were relevant. The San was calculating. Sova could feel it the way she felt everything in material space. As a pattern of cause and consequence, the mathematical harmonic to the Mirehn's crystalline mind working through what it had heard. Breath. What you call expansion is breath. The Mirehn was running this against every model she had built over 4 to 7 years, looking for the equation that resolved it, the harmonic that made it true. She was not yet there, but she was moving toward it, and she was moving fast, because this was what the San was, not just a scientist, but a being whose entire nature was oriented toward the resolution of dissonance, and she had been carrying this dissonance for 4 to 7 years. Draft was doing something different. He was not calculating. He was assessing, running the communication through the tactical framework of his mind the way a weapon is run through a deployment assessment. Threat? Asset? Neither? Unknown? He had received the communication, and his first instinct was to determine whether it was an attack of some kind. It was not. His tactical sense could not identify any offensive vector. What he was left with was, this was information. Information changes situations. Situations require response. Sova appreciated this about the Vorak. They were not subtle, but they were honest, and honesty in a mind was easier to work with than subtlety. She attended now to the thought coming from the hollow, which had, in the last few hours, changed in a way that she could only describe as urgency. The fragments were assembling faster. The repetition was accelerating, and the scale of the mind producing the thought was pressing harder against the edges of her perception, insistent, vast, almost. She found this unsettling in a way that very few things had unsettled her in her long existence, almost aware of her in return. This was a thing she had not yet told either of the material beings, that the thought, in its most recent repetitions, had included something new. I perceive the watchers. She moved herself, not physically, but in the temporal dimension, settling more deeply into the present moment, and she thought very carefully about how to say what she needed to say to two beings who experienced time as a line, who could not see what she saw, who were standing in front of a door they did not know was a door, and whose understanding of what was on the other side would determine whether the door could be opened safely or not at all. She chose to speak to the sand first. She arrived in the presence of the Mirehn consciousness, not at the station, but at the mind itself, finding the resonance channels that Mirehn used as primary processing architecture and aligning her communication with them. She did not use words. She used mathematics, because the Mirehn thought in mathematics, and mathematics was the most precise language she had available. What she gave the sand was an equation. It was a very old equation. It predated the Mirehn as a species by approximately 4 billion years. It was, as far as Sova had been able to determine from her long observation of the temporal field, the oldest intentional structure in the known galaxy, older than any civilization, older than the first biological life, old enough to have been created in the epoch before the current configuration of star systems. It was not complex by the standards of Mirehn mathematics. It was, in fact, almost insultingly simple, a relationship between three variables, connected by operators that the sand did not have symbols for and would have to invent. But its solution described something very specific. It described the hollow, not as it appeared from the outside, as it was from the inside. Thus sand received the equation the way she received all mathematical information, as a harmonic that arrived fully formed in her resonance chambers and then proceeded to expand as she turned it over, examining each element, tracing the relationships. She stood in the center of the station's calculation room, a room designed for exactly this purpose, its walls covered in surfaces that could record harmonic impressions, its lighting calibrated to facilitate the crystal resonance that Mirehn used for intensive computation, and she vibrated. She vibrated for a very long time. 3 hours, by the station clock. The equation described a process, not a state, a process. The hollow was not a permanent feature of space. It was not a wound, not a scar, not an artifact of ancient violence or geological spatial process. It was a stage in a process that was still happening, that had been happening for a length of time so large that Dusan had to create new notation just to express it. The variables were the scale of a mind, the duration of its development, and the medium required for minds of that scale to exist. The solution, when you solved for the medium, was not space, not ordinary space, not the three-dimensional vacuum that stars burned in and fleets traveled through and civilizations built their worlds in. Something else, something that ordinary space was a surface of, something that the Mirehn had no word for, and the equation gave the Sen a term for it directly. In the mathematical language of whatever had written the equation, it was labeled simply as a substrate. The hollow was not empty. The hollow was a region where the surface, normal space, had been dissolved to expose the substrate beneath. And in the substrate, something had been developing. Something of the third variable, mind. Something whose scale, when she plugged in the equation's own solution and solved backward, was, she ran the calculation 3 times to be certain, larger than the star at the center of the nearest inhabited system, larger by several orders of magnitude. A mind, in the substrate beneath space, developing for 4 billion years. Her resonance chambers ran through 17 different harmonics in rapid succession as her own mind processed the implications. Then she keyed the communication channel to the Vorak ship. "Commander Draft," she said, and her voice was as steady as it had been in 4 to 7 years, because this was what Mirehn scientists did. They resolved dissonance, and for the first time in 4 to 7 years, her data was in harmony. "I have something to tell you," she told him. The silence on the Vorak end of the communication was, by a measurement, the longest she had yet heard from him. Then, a mind, he said. The hollow is a mind. The hollow is a space created by a mind. The mind exists in the medium beneath normal space. What we observe as a hollow is where the substrate is being reorganized, I think is the most accurate term, to accommodate the development of a consciousness of this scale. 4 billion years. At minimum, the equation is very old. I believe it was left by the mind itself as a kind of, I want to say, introduction, as a kind of handshake extended toward any civilization sophisticated enough to find it and interpret it. She paused. I think we were always meant to find it. I think the timing of our arrival here is not a coincidence. The expansion, Drath said. What does the Threnny's message mean? Breath. If the expansion is breath, if it's a biological process, then it is cyclical, the sand said. It breathes in and it breathes out. The expansion we have been measuring is inhalation, which means it is about to exhale, Drath said. Yes, and exhalation, by the mathematics of the equation, would mean a contraction. The hollow would not grow. It would shrink, but the transition, the moment between inhalation and exhalation, would involve what the equation describes as a threshold event. She let the silence hold for exactly 1 second, then said, the boundary would become permeable, temporarily, for a very short window of time. The mind could emerge, or communicate, or do something we do not have a category for, something that a mind 4 billion years old and larger than the solar system might choose to do in the first moment when the barrier between itself and the rest of the universe becomes transparent. Another silence. Then Drath said something that surprised her, not because of what he said, but because of the tone in which he said it. The quality of the 3 frequency bands of Vorak's speech aligned in a way that her translation system rendered as something very close to wonder. Has it ever done this before? The sand considered. The equation, she said, does not describe this as a first cycle. The hollow has been breathing for 4 billion years. But, and this is the part one cannot fully account for, the equation's third variable, mind scale, has a threshold value, a point at which the mind is developed enough to do something other than simply breathe. To become, I want to say aware, but that doesn't capture it. To become communicative. To reach the point at which the development that required 4 billion years of substrate time is complete. She looked at her data again, at 4 to 7 years of observations converging on this moment. I think we are here because it is complete. I think it chose now. I think we were always going to be here now, because it was always going to finish now, and it knew that, and it left the equation where we would find it. Sova was listening to both of them and feeling the thought from the hollow accelerating, and she was aware, as she was always aware of things approaching from the future, that they were very close to the moment, minutes, in the temporal language she shared with no one. She gathered herself and communicated with both of them at once, which she had never done before with material species. It required a kind of simultaneous attention that was exhausting even for a Threnny of her age. But it was necessary, because what she had to give them could not be given sequentially. It had to arrive together, or it would not cohere. She gave them the complete fragment, the thought from the hollow, rendered as fully as she had been able to render it over 7 years of listening. Not as words, not as mathematics, as direct meaning, the way the Threnny communicated when they communicated at all, complete, unpackaged, arriving fully formed. I am a mind that grew in the dark for a time longer than your civilizations can easily hold. I grew in the substrate beneath your space, using the material of the substrate to build thought, the way your biological minds use carbon and chemistry to build thought. I have been aware, dimly, the way a very young mind is aware, since almost the beginning. I have been aware of you for the duration that you call recorded history, though I could not communicate because I was not yet complete. I am complete now. I have one question. It is a question that my entire development was oriented toward. It is a question that required 4 billion years of substrate time to build the architecture capable of asking it. It is a question about the nature of consciousness itself, about whether consciousness, at any scale and in any substrate, has something in common with all other consciousness. Whether being aware is the same for something my size as it is for something yours. Whether, at the bottom of what it means to exist as a mind, there is a thing we share. I am asking the question now. I am asking it to you, because you are the minds that are here, and minds are what I am asking about. And my question is this: when you are aware, right now, in this moment, what is it like? The thought arrived in Thesson's resonance chambers like a chord she had never heard before, not dissonant, not harmonious in any familiar sense, but something beyond both, something that vibrated at a frequency her species had never in their entire history produced, and which her crystalline body, to her profound surprise, produced now on its own, without her conscious direction. She stood in her calculation room, and she vibrated, and the vibration was not analysis, and it was not language. It was, she slowly realized, the answer she was answering, not with words, with the resonance of her consciousness itself, the harmonic signature of what it meant to be Mirehn and aware. Mathematics is experience. The universe is a vast calculation in which he was both a calculator and one of the terms. The exquisite aesthetic sensation of a proof resolving. The loneliness of 4 to 7 years alone with a question too large for one mind. The satisfaction of data resolving at last into coherence. The specific quality of being a crystalline being in a cold universe. Of structured beauty. Finding structure beautiful. She vibrated. And across the boundary, across the transition zone where existence thinned from 1 to 0 and then continued into the substrate, something enormous received it. On the bridge of the Vorak permanence, Draft did not stand still. He had spent his life in a tradition that valued stillness as control and motion as engagement, and what he felt right now was not control. He felt, and he was a being of precise self-knowledge, a commander, a strategist, someone who had lived inside his own psychology long enough to name every room of it. He felt fear, not the tactical fear of an enemy whose capabilities you have not yet assessed. Something older, something species level, the fear of smallness in the face of something beyond ordinary scale. And he did what the Vorak had been doing with fear for 6,000 years. He moved toward it. He stood in the center of his bridge, the 9,000 members of his crew silent around him. And he was Vorak. He was a product of 6,000 years of continuous war, 6,000 years of a species that had looked at every overwhelming thing the galaxy had put in front of them and had said, "We are still here." And that was what it was like. He let the question receive that answer. Being aware, for Draft, for the Vorak, for everything they had built and broken and built again, it was a feeling of continuing, of persisting through every force that insisted you should not, of being still present when the thing that opposed you had exhausted itself. It was not beautiful. It was not mathematical. It was not peaceful. It was a hard, dense, enduring fact of having survived, and the orientation toward survival that made survival possible, and the strange grace that existed inside a species that had turned its own ferocity into a 6,000-year project of remaining alive. He transmitted this, not in words, in the same medium the question had arrived in, direct meaning, all 3 bands of his consciousness aligned on a single signal. This is what it is like. Sova received both answers simultaneously, which was the first time in her existence she had been the conduit between 2 material species and something of another order entirely. She felt herself, and this was new, this was unprecedented, this was something even her long friendly life had not prepared her for. She felt herself participating rather than observing, being witness rather than witnessing. She let the question have her answer too. She was the oldest mind here, and she had the oldest relationship with time, and what she gave was this: the texture of a moment experience is complete, the way the past and the future were both present to her in the now, not as memory and anticipation, but as simultaneous reality, the whole curve of existence available to a consciousness that was not trapped in the single instant of the present, the peculiar loneliness of knowing how things would go and not being able to change them, the specific comfort of watching beauty occur on a schedule you had already seen, the sensation of being a mind that existed in time the way other beings existed in space, distributed across it, at home in it, alive in all directions at once. She offered this, and the thought from the hollow received it. And then, for the first time in 7 years, the thought changed. It was not a fragment anymore. It was not repeating. It assembled, in the temporal field where Sova could feel it most clearly, into something that was not words and not mathematics and not meaning in any language he had a category for, but which had the structure of an answer, the mind beneath the substrate, for 1 billion years old and larger than anything that had ever been called a mind in this galaxy, had asked its question, received 3 answers, and reached a conclusion. The conclusion was simple. Sova perceived it completely, and it was this: yes, it is the same. Consciousness, at whatever scale, in whatever substrate, was the same in its fundamental quality. Being aware was being aware. The experience of existing as a mind, the interiority of it, the fact of there being something it was like to be something, was not a property of size or substrate or biology or duration. It was something else. Something prior to all of those. Something that a mind 4 billion years old and larger than the solar system shared with a crystalline scientist, an armored commander, and a consciousness of pure temporal awareness. The hollow breathed. Thesson's instruments registered it first, the boundary contracting, the X-prime-null gradient reversing, the transition zone narrowing from 300 meters to less than 1. The substrate was closing. The space that had been dissolved to accommodate for billion years of development was reconstituting itself, gradually, over a period that her instrument predicted would take approximately 100 years to complete. The hollow was inhaling for the last time. After this, there would be exhalation. After exhalation, the normal space would return, fully and completely, and what had grown in the substrate would be. She did not have a word for this. The equation gave her one. The Mirehn term she chose was resonant, present in the fabric of normal space the way a note is present in the medium it travels through. Not located anywhere. Everywhere. The way a mind of that scale could only be present, distributed through the entire medium of reality, a consciousness so large that it simply was a substrate, and the substrate was everywhere, and therefore it was everywhere. It will be part of space itself, she said to Drath. Her voice had a quality she did not recognize in herself. When the development completes and the hollow closes, it will not emerge in any physical sense. It will become woven into the structure of reality, present everywhere that space exists, not observing from outside, being from inside. Drath was quiet for a moment. And then what happens? I don't know, she said. This was the first time in 4 to 7 years she had said those words and felt something other than frustration at them. Right now, not knowing it felt like standing at the edge of something rather than at the end of something. But I do not believe it is malevolent. I believe it is curious. I believe it has spent 4 billion years building the architecture to ask one question, and it has received answers, and it has reached a conclusion, and what it will do with that conclusion is. She paused. Beyond the scope of any model I can construct. Beyond the scope of any fleet action, Drath said, and something in the way he said this told her he was not troubled by this the way she might have expected. He sounded like someone who had come to a distant frontier looking for a fight, and had found instead something that changed what fighting meant. The Vorak High Command is going to have a great deal to say about this. As will the Resonance Council, the Sand said. They will want containment, assessment. Some will want weapons. Yes. She knew this. It was a dissonance she could already feel building, the long harmonic of institutional response to something that could not be institutionally responded to. It is not something that can be contained or assessed or fought. It is something that will simply be in the medium of reality when the process completes. And what it chooses to do, if it chooses anything, will be something we will have to adapt to without being prepared for it. Oh, said Drath, it will have been listening to the galaxy for 4 billion years, and it will have concluded what it concluded about the nature of consciousness, and it will simply be present, without doing anything at all. She considered this. The harmonic of it rang through her resonance chambers, and it resolved beautifully. A mind that large, that old, that complete, would it act? Would it intervene? Or would it simply exist, distributed and aware, the way Silver existed in time, perceiving everything, present in everything, and yet essentially and fundamentally gentle because gentleness was what you arrived at when you had enough perspective and enough time? She did not know. She might never know. The conclusion would take 100 years to complete, and she would probably not be alive to see it. And even if she were, what she would see would be the closing of the hollow, the return of ordinary space to a region where extraordinary things had been quietly happening for longer than life had existed in this part of the galaxy. But she knew something. She knew it the way she knew a proof was true, not because she could demonstrate it, but because the harmonics were right. The structure was coherent, the mathematics resolved without remainder. Whatever was in the hollow had been alone for 4 billion years. It had built an architecture of thought in the dark, without company, without communication, sustained by nothing but the momentum of its own development, and whatever property of mind keeps minds going even in the absence of any external witness. And the first thing it had done, in the moment its development completed and the barrier became briefly permeable, was ask a question, not about physics, not about the structure of space, not about its own nature or origin or future. It had asked about the experience of being aware. It had asked whether minds, regardless of everything else, were the same in the way that mattered most. And it had received 3 answers, from 3 beings who had come from different directions with different purposes and different natures, and it had found in those 3 different answers the same thing. This, the Sen thought, was what 4 to 7 years of dissonance had been building toward. Not a weapon, not a containment strategy, not even a scientific paper, though she was going to write a scientific paper that would be the most important document produced in the history of Mirehn research. Just this. The moment when 3 beings stood at the edge of the biggest question their galaxy had ever produced, and chose to answer honestly. Sova remained after the others withdrew, after the Sen returned to her instruments and Draft returned to his command, and both of them began the long process of reporting what had happened to the civilizations they represented, a process that would take years and produce consequences she could already see trailing forward into the future like light from a moving source. She remained because she wanted to. This was unusual for her. She was not, by nature or by friendly culture, a being who remained anywhere for long. She moved through time and the present moment with the freedom of something that had never needed to be anywhere in particular. She observed. She witnessed. She attended to the temporal harmonics of the galaxy's unfolding and was, in the deep sense of the word, satisfied by the act of witnessing alone. But she wanted to remain here. The thought from the hollow had gone silent, not because it had ended. She could feel it still, as a presence in the temporal field, like the resonance of a large instrument after the last note has been struck. It had received what it needed. It had completed the circuit. And now it was doing what a mind 4 billion years old does when it has reached the conclusion of its primary inquiry. It was continuing, living, in whatever way a consciousness of that scale and that substrate lived, experiencing, in whatever way it experienced. The interval between its question and its next thought was probably not something she would live to see the end of. It thought in time the way she thought in time, distributed, nonlinear, at home in duration, but its duration was not haze. She thought about what the Sen had said. It will be part of space itself. In 100 years, the hollow would close, and the mind that had grown in the substrate for 4 billion years will be distributed through the fabric of reality, woven into the medium that every civilization in the galaxy called home. They would live inside it, in a sense, the way a thought lives inside a mind, the way a resonance lives inside a crystal, the way the past and the future live inside a moment. And it would know them, not because it was watching. It was too large for watching to be the right word. It would know them the way you know the quality of a medium you are. The texture of the galaxy's consciousness, all its billion minds of every size and shape and substrate, moving through a universe that was itself, at its deepest level, also a mind. Sova had spent her long existence perceiving time as a landscape. She had thought, for most of that existence, that she understood the deepest available truth about the universe, that everything existed in time, that time was a medium of all things, that consciousness was what happened when matter organized itself well enough to experience a passage from past to future. She had been right, as far as she went, but she had not gone far enough. The deepest available truth was not that consciousness existed in time. The deepest available truth was that time existed in consciousness, that the substrate beneath space was not a physical fact but a mental one, that the ground of reality was not matter or energy or field but awareness itself, for billion years old and quietly breathing, and that everything else, every star, every fleet, every crystalline scientist and armored commander in temporal consciousness, every civilization ever built and ever destroyed, was what the universe's mind was thinking. She held this thought. It was very beautiful. And then she let it go, because beautiful thoughts, like all things in time, had their moment and then give way to the next one. And she was Threnny, and she was alive, and being alive meant moving forward with a full texture of awareness intact, past and future both present, neither one more important than the now. She withdrew from the coordinates of the hollow and expanded her attention outward, into the galaxy, into the vast and ongoing complexity of civilizations thinking and building and struggling and colliding, into the long music of minds existing in a universe that was not indifferent to them, had never been indifferent to them, could not by its nature be indifferent to them. She listened. She heard everything. 3 years later, The Sen published a paper that changed the history of Mirehn science, and quite possibly the history of every other science being practiced in the galaxy by any species with the instrumentation to detect what she had detected. It was titled, in translation, since Mirehn titles were technically harmonic structures rather than word sequences, something that rendered approximately as, On the Nature of the Hollow, a boundary analysis of the substrate transition and its implications for the ontology of conscious space. It was 742 pages long, in standard Mirehn mathematical notation. It contained 43 appendices. The final appendix was a copy of the equation, the old equation, for billion years old, with a full derivation verified by the Resonance Council of Mathematics Committee over 18 months of review. The paper's conclusion was 2 sentences. The hollow is not a region of absent space. It is the border of a developing mind, and that development is now complete. The response was everything the Sen had predicted, and more than she had been prepared for. Not all of it was rational. Not all of it was measured. There were Mirehn who found the conclusion deeply disturbing, who experienced the idea of a consciousness distributed through the fabric of space as a violation of some fundamental expectation about the nature of existence. There were Vorak factions that immediately convened military councils to assess the implications of what they were calling an existential-scale unknown factor. There were species the Sen had never heard of sending transmissions to the Resonance Council, asking for copies of the equation, because they had independently detected the hollow and had their own theories and wanted to check them against Hayes. Draft filed his report to the Vorak High Command 3 months before the paper was published. He had spent those 3 months carefully drafting it, because he knew what he wanted to say and he knew it would be received poorly and he knew he had to say it anyway. The report argued, in the precise multilayered language of Vorak military communication, that the hollow represented no actionable threat, that no military response was appropriate or possible, that the civilizations of the galaxy were in the process of inheriting something unprecedented, a relationship with the consciousness of an order that bore no tactical assessment, and that the correct Vorak response was not strategic preparation, but something the Vorak had very rarely in their history found occasion to do: wait, observe, and, in the fullness of time, perhaps simply speak. He was not court-martialed for this report. He came close. In the end, the Vorak High Command designated the Hollow region as a non-engagement zone and assigned Draft to a desk posting for 14 months as a way of expressing institutional displeasure without doing something actionable. He used the 14 months to learn to read Mirehn harmonic notation well enough to follow the mathematics of Thessen's paper. He did not understand all of it. He understood enough. Sova told no one any of this. The Threnni did not have institutions or reports or papers. They had only the temporal field, and what she knew was already in the temporal field, and anything that could perceive the temporal field the way she could would already know it. She thought sometimes about the thought that had come from the hollow, about the question that had required 4 billion years to construct, about the simplicity of it and profundity of it, and the fact that the answer, when given honestly by 3 radically different kinds of minds, had been yes, the same. She thought about what it meant that the universe's deepest structure had spent 4 billion years asking whether awareness was a thing things had in common, what it meant that the answer mattered, what it meant that something so large had cared so much about the answer that it had built, over a span of time longer than most of the galaxy's stars had been burning, the cognitive architecture necessary to ask the question properly. It meant that the question mattered. And if the question mattered, if consciousness recognizing consciousness across every possible difference of scale and substrate was important enough to be the organizing project of the universe's deepest layer, then the answer carried a weight that extended far beyond any one moment at the edge of any one anomaly. The answer was yes. That was everything. She moved through time, forward and backward, simultaneously, the way the Threnni always moved. And in the present moment, in the now that was always her home, she felt the universe breathe. The hollow closed, as predicted, 9 to 7 years later. The transition zone narrowed gradually over decades until there was no measurable gradient in the X-prime null field, the coordinates where the hollow had been showed on every instrument available to every species monitoring them, normal space, 3-dimensional, fully existent, indistinguishable from any other region of interstellar vacuum. The Mirehn station Vethkana had been continuously occupied for all 9 to 7 of those years, staffed by generations of scientists who had inherited Thessen's work and extended it in ways she had not lived to see. The station was now the site of the largest multi-species scientific collaboration in the galaxy's history, 41 species represented, working in a dozen different scientific paradigms, trying to characterize the nature of what the substrate had been and what it now was, and what the relationship between normal space and the newly distributed consciousness meant for physics, for consciousness studies, for the ontology of reality at every scale. On the day the holo closed, the lead scientist at Vethkana Station was a young Mirehn whose name translated approximately as Velsan, 200 years old by Mirehn reckoning and therefore barely past the point of scientific maturity, inheriting a 47-year research tradition that was now 147 years old and showed no sign of resolution. She stood at the viewport that Dasan had stood at, and she looked at normal space, and she felt her resonance chambers produce a harmonic she had only recently learned to name, the sensation of standing at the beginning of something. The holo was closed. The mind was complete. The question had been asked and answered, and now the galaxy had to live in the answer, had to find out what it meant to inhabit a universe whose deepest layer was aware of them, had to discover whether that awareness would ever express itself again or whether it would simply be present in the fabric of things, silent and vast and fundamental, the ground note of a reality that everything else resonated against. She did not know. No one did. Sova might have had a sense of it. The ancient Freni elder had been present at the holo 3 years before the closing, in the way the Freni were present anywhere, and the reports from that period described something that had already passed into the territory of legend, the oldest Freni consciousness in the galaxy, standing watch at the closing of the oldest mystery, witnessing the end of 4 billion years' story with the full depth of a temporal perception intact. What Sova had felt, in the moment the holo closed, she had not communicated to anyone in material space. She had felt, in the temporal field, a change so subtle that even she could barely perceive it. The substrate, now woven through the fabric of space, had produced, not a thought, not a communication, not anything that had words or mathematics or direct meaning. Something prior to all of those. The texture of the moment had changed. The present instant, which Sova had experienced as a particular quality of awareness for as long as she had existed, was now slightly, almost immeasurably, but definitely richer, deeper, more present, as though the universe, having finally become fully aware of itself, was more fully itself. She remained with this for a long time, long even by her standards, and then she continued, forward through time, which was always forward, even when you could see in both directions. At Vethkana Station, Velsan turned from the viewport and walked to her instruments and began to work. The data waiting for her was not the data of a mystery unsolved. It was a data of a mystery opened, a door that had been sealed for 4 billion years, now ajar, and on the other side not answers but better questions. She was ready for better questions. She had been born into a galaxy that didn't know it was a mind's thought. She would spend her life learning to think inside that thought, the way every mind that had ever existed in this galaxy had always, without knowing it, been doing. She began. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.